Good morning. Our first speaker this morning, Dr. Donderi, is a retired associate professor of psychology at McGill University in Montreal and a former associate dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research at McGill. Donderi earned his undergraduate degree, his BA and his BSc, from the University of Chicago and his PhD in experimental psychology from Cornell University. While a graduate student at Cornell, he worked for IBM to develop radar navigation displays for the B-52 bomber. His basic research interests are in human memory, perception, and thinking, and his applied work has included projects in marine navigation, naval architecture, nuclear power plant operation, agricultural inspection, computer interface design, and aviation human factors. He is the co-author of a psychology textbook, editor of a second textbook, author of over 100 research papers and technical reports, and most recently of UFOs, ETs, and alien abductions. A Scientist Looks at the Evidence, published by Hampton Roads in 2013. Here to talk about evidence of ET abductions from the viewpoints of science, scientific intelligence, and common sense. Let me welcome to the stage Dr. Donderi.
Thanks very much. Oh. Thank you very much. I'd like to start this talk by pointing out that it is in honor of two people with whom I collaborated closely for many years, both of whom died in 2011 and aren't here to appreciate the fruits of their work. Stuart Appel and Bud Hopkins, both close collaborators, both very much involved. In fact, I was a collaborator with them, not the other way around, in the work that I'm about to report today. So, as I said, a good part of this talk is in honor of them. The talk has several parts, but I'm going to introduce the thesis first. The thesis is some of what people report as UFOs are extraterrestrial vehicles. Some of those vehicles have extraterrestrial crews, and some of those crews catch and release humans to study us. Propositions 1 and 2 are established, I believe, beyond reasonable doubt. Proposition 3, the fact that there's a catch and release program, is established on the balance of probability. As any of you know, beyond reasonable doubt is the standard of proof in a criminal trial. Balance of probability is the standard of proof in a civil trial. The two research contributions I'm going to start talking about are designed to buttress or strengthen the probability that the catch and release program is real and that we have experienced it. The rest of the talk will be about two different things. The first is, why doesn't the elite media or the scientific establishment pay attention to evidence that's been available for the last 65 years, basically since the Kenneth Arnold sighting? And the third part of the talk is, what should we do about it? What should our policy be as citizens, and what should the policies of our governments be towards the fact of extraterrestrial surveillance of Earth? So that's where I'm going to go, and I'm going to start, first of all, by giving credit to several other people who are here, very much alive, and who've participated in the origins of this work and in some of the thinking, and I borrowed some of the thinking from them that has carried me forward. First of all, David Jacobs and Ron Westrom, both of whom have spoken on this podium yesterday, yesterday, both were involved with Bud Hopkins in developing a test called the Survey for Unusual Personal Experiences, which was given to American citizens in the 90s by the Roper Poll organization. Thousands of people were surveyed in an absolutely correct statistical fashion. If those people answered 11 questions, which were inserted in the survey without mentioning that they had anything to do with UFOs or abductions, if those people answered 4 out of 5 particular questions in an affirmative way and answered negatively to a 5th question, it was assumed by Hopkins, by Jacobs, and by Ron Westrom that these people were very probably abducted. Now, the results of this survey were overpowering. There were a huge percentage of the people who responded that way, somewhere like 2% of the American population, which is a very large number. At the meeting where this was presented, I stood up and very politely objected. I said, that's interesting, but I think you've got to do some follow-up work. And I then suggested, in a talk that I had prepared because I knew this in advance, about a minimum of $150,000 worth of work that should be done to follow this program up. I suggested hiring people to telephone all of these people who'd left their personal demographic information with the organization, follow-up phone interviews for those who looked promising, bring them to some central place and actually interview them in person, so forth and so on. In other words, following up extremely thoroughly on what looked like a fascinating and very promising beginning survey result. Nobody gave us $150,000 thereabouts to do this. I didn't honestly follow it up myself by writing a grant application to either the Canadian organization responsible for this, which is the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, or the American equivalent, Natural Science Foundation, because I knew they wouldn't give us the money. But the idea was there, and a few years later, I was very happily called by Ted Davis, a very alive current contributor to this work, who was a sidekick of Bud's. And Bud and Ted together, Ted is a social worker, had put together a test they called the Hopkins-Davis Personality Inventory. Now, this test, which had some 608 questions in it, was designed to sort out people who were abductees, but maybe didn't know it, from people who weren't, that is, controls, who had no reason to think that they were abductees, or nobody else had any reason to think they were abductees. And Ted Davis and Bud had developed this test. They'd given it to about 20 or 22 of their own abductees, plus a couple of abductees provided by other researchers, David among them, I think. And then they had given their test to a few controls in the New York City area, which is where Bud and Ted were based. And they called me and asked if I'd cooperate on analyzing the results, because I'm a psychologist with statistical knowledge and the tools to do that work. They also needed more data, so I was willing to help them collect it, largely because at McGill, where I was a professor at the time, the students could get credit for doing research for research-oriented courses, and I could provide them with projects based on this work to gain research credit. So at nobody's expense, except the students' effort, I was able to collect a great deal more control data from people in the Montreal area and data from people that Bud and Ted had not tested. We gave people tests that were designed to find out what they knew about UFOs and the phenomenon. And this was after our own test had been given to most of these people, the controls. But we primed a certain subgroup of people, 20-odd people, by giving them those tests first. Have you ever seen a UFO? Has anything ever happened to you that's unusual? Have you seen any strange lights or people entering your house and so forth and so on? The kind of leading questions that would make you think that these people are after something. And what it is, we then told them after they'd taken all these questionnaire tests. We said, now we'd like you to pretend that you'd been abducted by a UFO and answer this big long test we had as if you had. So we had three groups of people. We had simulators, people we asked to take the test as if they'd been abducted. We had the controls that I had provided, or my students had provided, and had been provided by Bud and Ted. And we had the abductees that had been provided by Bud and Ted. The results of this study, once I analyzed it using some statistical techniques, which are really too complicated to explain, were quite clear. But before we get to the results, I'll remind you of where you can read about the results. In that book, which will be signed by me, if you want a copy, over at the vendor table after the lecture. Back to the results. This is going to be a very brief description for a non-technical audience of something that requires about a half hour of explanation itself. The test, the so-called Hopkins-Davis Personality Inventory, which, as I pointed out to them, would be like giving a test to people who knew anything about Bud Hopkins, like going to a psychologist's office and taking the Freud neurosis test. Everybody would know what you're after by giving it that name. So we called it the American Personality Inventory for the purpose of this test. The American Personality Inventory has many scales. Each scale is based on some of the 608 questions that were asked. And each scale can be scored in a way that, according to Bud and Ted, suggested you've been abducted or didn't suggest you've been abducted. And the scales had something like a sense of general wrongness. That's wrong at the top. down to the bottom where it says something like, God, I can't even read it myself, babies. Have you experienced, as David's talk last night might have suggested, with unusual babies under unusual circumstances, and so forth and so on. They had gone through all of the symptomatology of abductees, extracted and made up questions that represented how people would respond if they'd been abducted on these symptoms, and put them into this huge 608-question questionnaire. It was based on the design of a test called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a standard psychological test used widely in clinics to sort out people's troubles, basically. Anyway, when this test was given to the abductees, to the simulators, and to the controls, you can see what the results were from this graph. The abductees scored right down the middle in almost every case on these scales. Their results are in the dark black line that jaggedly wends its way down through each of these scales. The lower the score, the less likely you were to have been an abductee. The controls score lower. That's the dotted line, as you can see, always lower on this set of scales. And the simulators, the dashed line, score higher on almost all of the tests than the abductees or the controls. And using appropriate statistical techniques, we sorted out these results, and the results are quite conclusive, that on this test, for this particular sample of people, the abductees scored right in between the simulators, who overdid it, and the controls, who underdid it. So it was possible to separate the wheat from the chaff on this test with a total sample of 75 or so people. In a further sophistication of this analysis, using another technique that would take me a half hour to explain, called discriminant analysis, we were able to isolate a subset of some 65 questions that unequivocally separated these three groups of people once you knew how to score them. And that's something I just can't possibly go into. But I assure you it's kosher, and it's even, and I'll tell you why, because it's been published in a peer-reviewed journal just last month, or 2 months ago. The abductees, the simulators, and the controls all come out differently on this scale. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, they are separate, at least in the sample that we had. Now, any of you who know anything about research know that one set of results like this doesn't prove anything. It merely adds to the balance of probabilities that the proposition that you presented is true. It would have disconfirmed this result if all of those people were indistinguishable. Then you would have been able to say that Donderi and Hopkins and Davis have shown nothing that separates abductees from anybody else. Case closed, let's go on to something else. Well, this doesn't do that. It doesn't close the case. It doesn't solve the case, but it suggests the case is worth pursuing. And that's what this experiment hoped to provide, because obviously you don't go into an experiment with a completely neutral attitude. You want it to show what you hope it shows, but you can't do it without offering the probability that, or the possibility that it might fail. We had the possibility that it might fail. It didn't fail, and this result demonstrates that. That's what we call the American Personality Inventory, and that's the work I did with Bud and Ted Davis and myself. I should mention, I talked to Kathleen Marden on Friday at one of the gatherings of this convention, and she pointed out to me that she has developed her own questionnaire, which she's now got, I believe, on her own website. Kathleen Marden is the co-author with Stanton Friedman of the second book about the Barney and Betty Hill abduction. She is Betty Hill's niece and knows the case very well, put it plainly. And Kathleen and I will get together and talk about how both of these questionnaires can be used, probably the 65-question version that we sorted out from this longer one, and hers, to provide a kind of screening for potential abductees. Again, with no either proof or guarantee that anyone who screens out as a potential abductee is one, but at least it's better than nothing, and we know that these three categories of people can be discriminated on the basis of at least one test. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about, and probably even more controversially, is something called alien symbols. This again goes back to work that I did at the request, or with the help of, Bud Hopkins and Stuart Appel, my two late colleagues, who I regret deeply are not here to listen to what this is all about. Again, in talking to Bud at one point or another and he's mentioned this obviously publicly many times, he collected symbols that people said they remembered seeing inside alien craft when they'd been abducted. Stewart is an experimental psychologist like me, or was an experimental psychologist like me. Stewart also was a hypnotist, like Bud. And it occurred to Stewart that he should do something very much like what we did with this personality test, although quite independently. His idea was that he would find control subjects at his university, State University of Brockport, and he would hypnotize those controls and ask them to imagine they'd been abducted on an alien spaceship. And then after they came out of the hypnotic session, he would ask them post-hypnotically to remember symbols that they'd seen inside the alien craft. Now I think you're beginning to get the picture. If his controls imagined symbols that were no different than the symbols that Bud's abductees, alleged abductees, had remembered, then again the whole case would collapse. There'd be no reason to think that the people who claimed they'd been abducted and remembered symbols were remembering anything different from people who had been asked to imagine being hypnotized, imagine being abducted under hypnosis, and then drew symbols that they, quote, remembered after the abduction. Well, the experimental technique is obvious. Put these two sets of symbols together, take off all the information that might have indicated which group they came from, and ask people to compare them. My part of this came in because I had developed, quite independently of this, for totally other reasons, some statistical techniques that enabled that comparison to be made relatively easily by an audience like yourselves who would just sit down in front of these unmarked symbol sets and sort them into groups that looked similar. And from that information, using the statistical technique I developed, I was able to put them into what you might call a space in which the distance between any two symbols in this space was analogous to the distance between two things in physical space. And the closer things are together in this similarity space, the more they look alike, psychologically. So that's what we did. And as an aside to this, and a fascinating aside, I was having an email correspondence with a fellow named Greg Sando, who was one of Bud's friends and collaborators in New York. Greg is a Juilliard Music School professor, and he has been interested in UFOs for a long time. And as he said to me, he keeps his two lives separate. His UFO life is one thing, his professional life is another. He doesn't talk about UFOs at Juilliard, and he doesn't talk about music to UFO audiences. At any rate, Greg told me, this just a couple of weeks ago, after I'd prepared this talk, that it was he who suggested to Bud that Stuart Appel be called into the picture because Greg, who knew Stuart, knew that he was a hypnotist and could get control subjects. So I really have to credit Greg Sando, who I didn't realize was part of the picture until about 2 weeks ago, for having developed some of this research. So Stuart and Bud and Greg and I put together the results that you're now going to see. This is, again, something that would take a half hour by itself to explain. It's a plot in 3 dimensions of the locations of the 12 symbol sets that Bud had developed in the black squares to the lower left, and the 24 symbol sets that were imagined by Stuart, with one possible overlap in the middle, that little black dot that's standing out by itself. The Hopkins set sits all by itself in the corner, completely separate from the symbol set that was generated out of the imaginations of Stuart Appel's imaginary abductees. Now, what about these symbols? There's a caveat here. First of all, I won't show any more of the symbols than I've already put on a display that was given at a psychology conference as a poster a couple of years ago. The more these symbols are shopped around, the more anyone can copy them and say, I've been abducted, here are my symbols. And so that wouldn't work. Second caveat is this. As some of you who are, which I might call, very familiar with the UFO world know, Bud's estranged ex-wife, Carol Rainey, said and has made public the statement that Bud cherry-picked the data that he gave me and has shown others about the symbols, and that they don't all look like the ones I got. I can't answer that because I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's been asserted publicly, and it has to stand as something on the public record. I have about 9 or 10 other symbol sets Bud gave me after this set of data had been assembled and the experimental work had been done. I haven't yet put those through the test, if anyone else, including David Jacobs, has more, because David is Bud's intellectual property executor, I will gladly go back to work on those symbols, redo this, and see if we come out with the same results the second time. So this is the result, and here are the very small set of symbols that I have already presented and are presenting again. Stewart's were much more varied, much mixed up, didn't look like anything in particular. These are 3 separate sets from Bud, and they're consistent in the type of little things that you see. And I'm sure many of you have seen these online because other people have published symbol sets as well. At any rate, our research went to increase the balance of probability, not prove that the alien abduction experience is real. And as I pointed out with the first set of experiments, when you do scientific research in the 20th century, the philosophical context is that you're really trying to set up a situation where your hypothesis can be disconfirmed. And some philosophers of science think that's the only way science moves ahead, by the possibility of disconfirming a theory. And this experiment opened the possibility that